This episode, we are reviewing the movie Iceman from 1984, not to be mistaken with a whole bunch of other movies that are also called Iceman, including a recent one about Otzi the Iceman.
Hang on. I watched the one from 2017.
Oh no! So, do we need to come back to this another day?
Oh God. How did I miss that?
Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a PhD candidate studying Neanderthal teeth. I'm here with my co-hosts.
I'm Dr. Kimberly Pomp. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Simon Fraser University, and I look at human skeletal variation and how we have evolved and how that impacts our health.
And I'm Dr. Ross Barnett. My background is in ancient DNA and using kind of genetic technologies to examine extinct species, particularly Ice Age extinct species.
And today we're talking about the movie Iceman from 1984, which, as we've discovered, is a difficult movie to find because out of the 6 or so movies called Iceman, I think this is the most obscure.
Mm-hmm.
Does one of us want to give a summary of this movie?
I can.
Well, I think Ross watched it more recently.
Yeah,
So.
I'm probably the most recent person on the planet to have watched it, I guess. So basically, the story of Iceman is some researchers of a very kind of nebulous research agenda are in the Arctic Circle researching, and they find a perfectly preserved body in the ice, which they take back to base, and they thaw that out using their research technology, which obviously has multiple uses, I'm sure. And while they're thawing it out, they have some big discussions about how feasible it would be to bring back living tissue from the past. And lo and behold, this Iceman turns out to not just be perfectly preserved, but capable of being revived, which is what they do. And then because he's just woken up from 40,000 years of hibernation, he's a bit confused. So they stick him in their giant vivarium, which they also have at their research center, and let him kind of chill out a little bit. And then one of the researchers, who's an anthropologist, allegedly, tries to make friends with him and learn a bit about him. And that doesn't go very well, I think, overall. And eventually he escapes, kills one dude, and they decide to set out into the kind of Arctic Circle together, the anthropologist and this defrosted guy. And then he dies at the end. So it's really as simple as that. I didn't really like it, I have to say.
No, I loved it.
Really?
I thought it was great, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd be happy to hear which parts you loved.
I liked a lot of it, but I think that the overall theme is a little dated and problematic.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I loved it in that from a 1984 movie.
It did feel very, very 80s in that kind of earnest and taking everything super seriously. And, we're not making a creature feature about defrosting a Neanderthal. This is saying big things about big questions. But that's what they were trying for. But I don't think they actually did.
It felt very 80s in that there had to be obvious villains, like good versus bad, because the scientists were just, that's watching this movie, I thought, wow, no wonder the public doesn't mistrust scientists if this is what we grew up watching, is because aside from the hippie anthropologists, all the scientists were horrible. Let's slice him up and just see what he looks like from the inside.
I think that they had a fair bit of nuance towards the end. There was like a growth arc to almost all the scientists. They all, in that sense, I really liked it. It was complex. I feel like it was very much more realistic and trying to be very deep and thoughtful version of Encino Man.
Yeah, the parallels are definitely there.
Let's start off, as I always try to have some structure to the podcast. Let's start off with nitpicking, little inaccuracies. I think that the beginning of this movie has a lot of exposition and a lot of little details that we can criticize, and that's why when we talked last week, Ross, and you suggested that maybe we could review it even though you hadn't seen it. We really want to talk about some of these this medical procedure and the genetics and stuff that they talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I think my favorite line was, "Oh my goodness, it's synthesizing DNA."
Yeah,
I'll start with one mistake or technical inaccuracy, but I don't think they say explicitly, but it's pretty heavily implied they're in Alaska. Or do we agree on that?
yeah.
They're in the Arctic, and it's an
They're in the
American
Arctic
company.
Circle, yeah. So they might be in Canada, but
And there are the anthropologist is working with Inuit, so it's definitely in North America.
Mm-hmm.
But they find a Neanderthal, and there's no good evidence that Neanderthals would have been anywhere near the North American Arctic. They go to about Central Asia at the farthest east. So that's one thing. They shouldn't have found a Neanderthal there. Although, I mean, that's, I guess, technically possible that there could be Neanderthal sites distributed farther north across Siberia than we know about. But as far as we know, that shouldn't be possible
for them to travel that. I think the ice sheets were too thick at that point, wasn't it, Ross?
No, they could have got to Alaska. I mean, that's just the kind of the as far as they could have got. The kind of Alaska and bits of the Yukon are the fringes of eastern Beringia.
Right.
So they are ice free all throughout. They couldn't have got any further than that. They couldn't have got down into more mainland Canada and down past there. But yeah, he wasn't really dressed for Arctic winter.
No.
When they thawed him out, he was a long way from home, I think.
Yeah, I really liked how they weren't sure that it was a human versus they thought it was a mammoth up until they had him like almost out of the ice, and you're just like, there's a certain point that it becomes obvious it's not a mammoth. That
part actually rang a bit true, like not knowing what you had until it was defrosted. I mean, if we're doing nitpicking at the minute, like Josh suggested, then for a start, the ice is far too clean. I mean, you could see through it. That's not how the ice is up there. It's more like kind of chocolate mud. Really, it's really kind of grainy and not really pristine like it is in the film. One thing that really annoyed me, and that's just because it's a bugbear of mine, people that kind of just make up scientific sounding names. So they talk about how they think it could be a mammoth, and then they say Mammoth mastodonus or something, trying to sound like a kind of Linnaean name. I mean, no, that's just not. I mean, it could. You had mastodons in that region as well, but that's the Linnaean binomial for mastodon is Mammut americanum, and the binomial for mammoth, or woolly mammoths, which is what would be there, is Mammuthus primigenius. So they've kind of butchered. They've got two things wrong right there, just in that one 2-word phrase. That just annoyed me.
I think they definitely they didn't do as much encyclopedia reading as they did for Encino Man.
Yeah, who would have thought, Encino Man had better background research than this film.
I realized when I was editing the last podcast that I think we have very different feelings about the amount of research that went into Encino Man, and I feel like maybe we're like very generous to it because it says so little, so it doesn't incriminate itself as bad as the ones that say a lot. I think they did a lot of research on this, and I think it's when they say so much that that it's really easy to pick out the little mistakes. I don't think they did that much research on Encino Man. I think that they just did some really cursory stuff and then just kept quiet.
Yeah, but that works though. At least they're not spreading inaccurate science then.
I guess it's kind of the like Josh says, I think it's the kind of disjunct between what you expect and what you get. So I think it's good that Encino Man, we didn't expect a lot, but what was there wasn't obviously rubbish. Whereas with this film, you kind of expect a bit more. And yeah, I think they've clearly done some research, but it's just those little details that would be good for sort of scene setting and kind of increasing the believability of what it was trying to do, that they fall down on pretty early. And it didn't have to be like that. Like it was nice that they brought up Dima, who's like one of the most famous mammoth mummies. And he was found in 1979. And that's a classic black and white photo, which is public domain, often gets used in any discussions about mammoths. But then they kind of go a bit off piste with that when they talk about how they were going to take some of Dima's cells and put them into elephant eggs and make baby mammoth elephant hybrid kind of stuff. I mean, people talk about that now, but I don't think they were talking about that particularly back in the 70s. Who knows?
Let's talk about the facility, which you already mentioned, Ross. There's a very strange facility that they have at the beginning of the movie after literally 3.5 minutes of opening credits, which we can thank George Lucas that we don't have to do that anymore. You know that story?
No.
Yeah.
I don't know what organization had some rule that you had to have opening credits, and George Lucas didn't want them for Star Wars, so he just didn't do it, and then he got a big fine for it. But then after that, he set the precedent, and now we don't have to deal with opening credits. So there's 3.5 minutes of opening credits with a helicopter flying with a block of ice underneath it. After that, we cut to a printer, an old dot matrix printer, slowly showing this message: Polaris Mining and Chemical Company. So this is the company we're dealing with. But they thaw out this Neanderthal and they put him into a facility where they've been keeping all kinds of wild animals. So it has like rocks and plants growing, and it's like biodome. We talked about that last time too, right? It's like a little biodome that they put him in.
Well, it definitely set it up to look like a villain's, like a supervillain's lair.
Yeah.
That's what it looked like. Like that's what people assume when they're afraid of scientists. That's what they assume we're all doing, right? It's mysterious experiments.
It was just so weird. If they're a mining and chemical company, why do they have brown bears and wild boars and frogs and snakes and Arctic foxes and all sorts of stuff and a vivarium? I mean, it seemed, it's not really that important, but surely there must have been something they could have thought of that would have made more sense than a mining outpost with essentially a mini zoo inside it.
Well, I mean, even if the mining company had found a frozen Neanderthal and unthawed it and it came alive, they wouldn't be like, okay, we can handle this. Let's start doing our own biological tests on him and just cut him up. Like they'd be geologists who didn't.
Bring in the experts.
The anthropologist who works there is a cultural anthropologist who's working with the Inuit, and I'm not exactly sure why a mining and chemical company has an anthropologist on staff who's working with the local Inuit.
Mm.
But they'd never call in an archaeologist or a paleoanthropologist, so they have this cultural anthropologist making his assessment, and he makes his assessment that it's a Neanderthal. He's like, I don't know, all we had was guesses and conjecture, and he looks at him and he says, moderate frontal ridge. I think he means the eyebrow ridge, which is not called a frontal ridge. It's called the supraorbital torus. He says, look at those teeth. He's a hunter. I don't know what that means.
Yes, that was great. Look at his teeth. He's a hunter. I think I spit out my tea when he said that.
I thought he might have been talking about did he not have a necklace with some teeth on it? That's the only thing I could use to make sense of that.
Oh, maybe.
Oh, I thought he meant his teeth.
Yeah, that's why I thought, first of all, that's too weird. He couldn't be saying that.
That would make sense then, yes.
Yeah, that makes way more sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we're giving it too much credit here.
Sorry, I can't. He said one other thing. I can't find it in my notes. Oh yeah, sloping forehead. Moderate frontal ridge. Look at those teeth. He's a hunter. Sloping forehead. And then he said, we found a goddamn Neanderthal.
Yeah, like that's the only criteria.
Yeah, it does bring up the interesting question, because we've seen Neanderthal and William as well, and we also criticized the prosthetic for only basically giving him a brow ridge and really nothing else. But I know how to identify a Neanderthal skull, but if we are looking at an actual living Neanderthal, I wonder what we would actually be looking at to try and make that diagnosis. You know, I'd be like, I don't know, let's CT scan his head, and then I'll be able to tell if he's a Neanderthal. But it's interesting what to think about how we would identify one if he was actually alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, would we, I guess, like orbit shape and sort of nasal size? We kind of presume that would have some effect on soft tissue appearance as well. But I guess we just don't know because we don't have any soft tissue Neanderthals.
Well, the occipital bun should show too, and you should at least be able to feel it. Right? We can feel our occipital protuberances in the back of the muscle attachment at the back of your head.
So what they needed wasn't a cultural anthropologist, they needed a phrenologist, really.
Yes.
But yeah, so they had a cultural anthropologist somehow on staff that they just pulled in, but they never contacted any other expert who like would have been an actual expert in Neanderthals. And I don't know what laws would be in this case, but if you find archaeological remains, I mean, you've got to actually contact an archaeologist, right? You can't just, even if you're a science company, you can't just use your own in-house scientists from different fields. There have to be laws in the United States about who needs to be contacted, right?
And presumably also the tribal authorities from where it's been dug up as well.
That's a good point.
I mean,
Well, I'm pretty sure if you found a fleshed humanoid body, you'd have to call the police.
yeah.
Or even
That's
unfleshed,
true.
actually. If you
Yeah.
found any human remains, you'd be phoning the police first. Even if it's archaeological, because it still has to have the paperwork, right?
Yeah, they were distinctly keeping this quiet because it says on the message, confidential, board members only. So they're definitely not contacting even the police or archaeologists. They're keeping this within the company. This is a trade secret for them.
Yeah, no, this is definitely some nefarious scientists
Well,
in a lair.
nefarious, I think the miners or the business people are the most nefarious. The scientists are just kind of swept up in it, I think, if I can make excuses for them.
But who was that blonde woman who said something like, well, we'll just cut them up and see. And the anthropologist said, no, we can't do that. And she was like, it's not your choice. She was a scientist, wasn't she?
I don't know. It kind of wasn't really explained what she was,
Well, you'd have to be a scientist to even care to cut them up, right?
I guess.
Or just, she was like, yes, now's my
Unless
chance.
she was just the on-site butcher. Like, they had like a bar and shops and stuff.
She's the one who sent the message that was coming off the printer at the beginning. Her name was Dr. Brady, and it says she's from the Arctic Biochemical Division. So the premise of cutting him up is that they were looking into cryogenics to keep people alive for medical procedures when they weren't in a position to be operated upon. They were looking for a mechanism to cool the body down and freeze it without killing it, so that they could transport somebody to a place where they could receive the proper medical care. That's what they want to do with this Neanderthal. I don't know why they suspected they were going to get anything useful out of a body that had been dead for 40,000 years, but that seems to be what she's doing. She's some sort of biochemist, and that's what her role is.
So I guess that's why they have the animals, is they're testing, instead of doing normal things or tissue or whatever, they're just putting random animals and freezing them and then seeing if they can bring them back.
But I mean, they're in the Arctic where there are animals that live outside in the cold, but instead they've got a whole bunch of not necessarily Arctic animals
like
kept
frogs
in a
and
heated,
pigs.
frogs. They have them kept in a heated vivarium, like climate controlled. So I'm not exactly sure what they're doing with the facility.
So it could have been, I think if they'd kind of made it that they were not a mining company or a chemical company, but they were a company interested in looking at cryonics, that would have made it much more sensible. Like, you can imagine a reason why a cryonics company would be in the high Arctic, just because the temperatures there would be useful for their research. And they could have all those animals, like bears that hibernate, Arctic foxes that change their color during winter, some species of amphibians that can go into like deep freeze. That would have solved all the kind of weird questions we're having. Why do these guys have like ice cutting lasers and fancy ice defroster machines? That would make a whole bunch of sense if these guys were like a cryogenics or a cryonics company.
But then why would they be digging? Why would they be digging though? Because
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe they're like cryonics / mining.
Yeah, the cryonics division of the mining and chemical company. There's one little thing that they got right, which nobody gets right in movies anymore, and I guess it's just an old enough movie that they're ahead of the meme. But once they were thawing him out and he unexpectedly started to show signs of life, then they started to switch to reviving him. And they were checking his heart rate and he was flatlining. And then instead of shocking him with the defibrillator when he was flatlining, they started doing chest compressions. And then once they got him into coarse fib, then they used the defibrillator, which is a common mistake that medical professionals always complain about in movies, that when somebody's flatlining, they give them a defibrillator, but that's not what a defibrillator does. You have to have some heart rate, some erratic heart rate in order for the defibrillator to work.
There has to be fibrillation for a defibrillator to be any use. But she was doing it the old-fashioned way, just full-on thumping his chest. I mean, that's putting some real welly into it. And the whole medical thing, they talk about artificial blood, and then there's a whole thing about DMSO and the idea that this Neanderthal somehow made his own antifreeze, which is quite interesting, if weird.
Well, and it was they suspected it was something that he was eating, wasn't it?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. They sort of talk about how the mammoths they found had buttercups in their stomachs, and I don't know. I don't think buttercups are a natural source of DMSO, but yeah. It was quite weird.
I think at first they were just sort of speculating, like right when he was waking up, they're like, how is this possible? And then Dr. Brady was just sort of speculating, maybe it was something he ate. And then she talks about DMSO. I don't think they were saying specifically it was DMSO, but they're like, here's a random possibility that can just keep this movie going. And then later in the movie, it was the anthropologist who suggested maybe it wasn't something he ate, maybe it was some sort of spirituality where he was getting himself into a state where his brain was creating its own antifreeze, and he was using an ethnographic comparison, showing people walking over coals and piercing their cheeks and things like this.
So it was a meditation almost.
Yeah, that was his role in the movie, where the scientists are the bad guys, but he's the anthropologist, so he's the good guy, and the scientists are ignoring the humanity, but they need the anthropologist to remind them about humanity and give that the human perspective on science, that you can maybe learn more by keeping him alive than you can by cutting him up.
Mm-hmm.
They did show some bits of him being almost cut up, which was quite weird. For some reason, they started cutting into his thigh. I couldn't think of any reason why. That would be the starting place to cut someone.
Well, it's where butchers start, isn't it? So
yeah, well, that's it. That's where the most meat is.
Yeah.
Also, when they're talking about mammoths, they talk about the Russians having found a mammoth, and they say 1898. And I think they're referring to the Bereskova mammoth, which was found in Russia in actually 1901, if my research is correct. And then they said, they asked what happened to that mammoth, and he said they ate it. They're mixing up some stories here, but do you know the stories about people having eaten mammoth, or the apocryphal stories of people having eaten mammoth?
Yeah, there's lots of apocryphal ones. I mean, definitely some of the mammoths they've dug up. I'm not sure if the Beresovka one, but certainly the Yarkov mammoth and the Adams mammoth, which I think are older than that one, the trunks were eaten by wolves. So the wolves had no problem eating it. It wasn't recorded whether they puked afterwards or died of really bad stomach ache, but it was, some bits of it did get eaten. And I think that, I mean, I don't know if any of the other kind of early naturalists that were involved with kind of Siberian exploration, like Pallas and Steller. I don't think any of them ate or recorded that they ate bits of mammoth. But I know that when they found Blue Babe, this Alaskan bison that was discovered in the late 70s by Dale Guthrie and taxidermied and preserved, once they'd finished preserving it, I think it's still on display at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. They had a big kind of celebration feast to celebrate the end of studying of this Blue Babe Pleistocene bison, and they did put a bit of Blue Babe into their soup, and all these kind of gathered experts like Dale Guthrie was there, Bjorn Curtin was there, a whole bunch of other big mammoth scientists were there, and they had a bit of Pleistocene bison in their soup.
That's the only story I could find that seemed like it actually had truth to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the stories about mammoth, most of them go back to this fictional story from 1951. Allegedly, the Explorers Club, whatever that is, met in New York, which was basically a bunch of rich people, and they had a meal that was just like a bunch of fancy rich people stuff to just like show off what they could eat. And on the menu was something listed as prehistoric meat. And it didn't specify that it was mammoth. So this is the story that keeps getting repeated over and over, where people say that these people actually ate frozen mammoth. But interestingly enough, a piece of meat was for some reason saved from this meal. I can't imagine why this piece of meat was saved for 30 or 40 years. But they saved it, and then eventually somebody actually DNA tested it, and it turned out it was a sea turtle.
Like new modern sea turtle?
Yeah.
Oh.
Sea turtle was also on the menu that night, so they, I think there was like a turtle soup, so they just like used some of the same turtle and just called it, this is prehistoric meat, and just lied about it.
That club, they only recently in the last, like within the 2000s, stopped eating endangered animals in their feast.
Do you know more about
Allegedly
the Explorers Club
stopped.
than I do?
I'm reading a book right now that's actually talking about it, because it's called The Dragon Behind the Glass. You'd really like it, Ross.
Oh, yeah.
And
Well,
it's
it's
about
cool.
this fish, this dragonfish was really popular for fish enthusiasts, and so it's a status symbol to own it. They're thousands of dollars. Somebody's been murdered for their collection of them, and
Ooh.
so the journalist is going around to try and find information about it. So she gets invited to one of these dinners, and when she's there, people are complaining about how they just have to eat regular food now.
People. There's also some ethnographic evidence that like certain native, I guess, northern Siberian groups use mammoth meat for fox hunting. Like they use it to bait their traps. Apparently, 'cause it just stinks so much that it attracts the foxes quite well, and they use that. I think I would try it if I had the chance. I would
You would try
have a
it?
nibble. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, gross. I thought when they said that it was like a Cold War dig, like they're not doing real science, they ate it. That's what I thought it was. I didn't even consider that people would actually eat mammoth.
There was also a beer or a whiskey from a craft brewery or a distillery recently that was put out that came with a part of mammoth tusk attached to the bottle or something. Cost like $1,500, and you're basically paying for the bottle.
Yeah, that's weird. I mean, there's all sorts of overlaps between paleo and brewing. There's always been claims for Pleistocene yeasts that have been taken out of permafrost areas and used to brew. I think there's a few companies that have claimed to do that, or yeast from Egyptian tombs and things like that. Use those to brew with. So that might be something interesting to look into.
Yeah. Isn't the first recorded recipe written down for beer?
Probably.
Yeah, I think so.
It's not one you'd want to forget.
So this movie has a sort of very strict 3-act sort of structure. The first act is all the fancy science stuff. The second act is basically just the main character, Shepard, the anthropologist, played by Timothy Hutton, just basically doing ethnography with the Neanderthal, Charlie. And they bring in a linguist as well, and basically the two of them just sort of hang out for the middle third of the movie and just learn from each other. I think that's my favorite part of the movie is that was
my
act.
I think that's what made me like it. Especially when they're singing. My favorite part is when they're singing Neil Young, and just both of them just sitting around the campfire enjoying music together. I thought that was so sweet.
I think that's the part I liked the least.
Oh, really? I thought it was so sweet.
I don't know. I really don't like Heart of Gold by Neil Young. I don't know why, but
I love that song.
I think is it a Canadian thing, possibly?
I don't think you're welcome on Canadian soil now that you've said that.
I shouldn't have had this in the recording. I don't know. And also, we kind of drifted away from the discussion of Charlie the Neanderthal and his kind of appearance. But I mean, what did you guys think about? Did they do a good job of? Did the actor do a good job of portraying a Neanderthal? Were the prosthetics any good? What did you think?
I thought he was a good actor. I think I didn't even really notice any prosthetics, so I thought that they'd only really just made his teeth look mucky. Did they add a brow? I don't remember.
I think there's a bit of a brow.
Yeah.
The actor who played Charlie, the Neanderthal, I don't know who he is. His name is John Lone. According to IMDb, the IMDb description, which seems to have been written by his ex-wife, it's very glowing. But he's a Chinese actor who, according to his ex-wife's description on IMDb, this was probably his peak movie, and I think he did a really great job. Very similar to Brendan Fraser in Encino Man, doing a very sympathetic portrayal of a caveman, a very human portrayal. And I thought his acting was really good. Like, he is obviously not speaking a modern language, so you don't know anything that he's saying, and the anthropologists are trying to learn his language. But he does a really good job of acting when he's speaking a language that's made up, I thought.
I kind of thought it was almost the polar opposite of William, in that William, as a Neanderthal, was very human, and he was kind of a very modern human in his kind of his way of holding himself and in his kind of reactions to stuff. Whereas I felt with this one, it was kind of, I mean, it's difficult to say because it's nearly 40 years old, this movie. Maybe all of our kind of stereotypical impressions of what Neanderthals or cavemen were like have come from this guy's kind of groundbreaking acting. But I felt like they kind of made Charlie look a bit like an idiot, like stuff that wouldn't have confused any moderately intelligent human or Neanderthal of what we think of as Neanderthals today, kind of confused Charlie. Like the whole kind of just, he didn't really kind of feel like he was asking questions when he was like stuck in the vivarium. He never like really pushed hard to escape until the end, and he kind of accepted Shepard coming to visit him without much kind of discussion or thought, and he only kind of got a few brief insights into what his kind of internal life was like when he started drawing pictures of his family, like what seemed like 3 weeks after they'd thawed him out, rather than like right at the beginning. So I don't know. I really kind of I didn't get that he was. I felt like it wasn't a great characterization of what should have been, an intelligent human individual. But I mean, that's probably just because our understanding of Neanderthals has moved on so much in the past kind of 30, 40 years that we're kind of I'm judging it unfairly based on knowledge that wasn't around at the time.
When I was watching that, what I thought, because what struck me is when they did that, after all the science, it's kind of the start of the second act where he wakes up in what looks like a lush Pleistocene environment, right? By the waterfall and everything. And for a while, I thought that it was a scene back before he was frozen. And then it pans out and it's only this small chunk of fake background. And then it's very much a modern, biodomy thing. It looks like SFU actually. And, but how he never noticed that, like he never noticed there was no sky or anything. But then I thought that's really strange that they had it so that his perception was only immediately for this one section. But then I thought, what if aliens, because essentially this is what happened, is he went to sleep and he woke up in what would be equivalent to us waking up on Mars with a civilization that we don't understand, with technology that we don't understand, with materials that we've never seen before. And maybe your brain would just be like, no, just look over here. Don't look over there. That's nothing. And then, our brains do that. They do, they're like, this is too much. Just focus on this. And then when you do see, so when Shepard comes in, you do see somebody who's recognizable. I don't know. I think you would just be like, nope, this is my friend now. Because otherwise it's almost too much to take in everything else. So that's how I justified it.
That could be it.
He also did attack Shepard right away when he came in. That was the first thing. And then once he realized he wasn't a threat, then they started interacting peacefully. The part that I really liked, which was also sort of the opposite of Encino Man, in Encino Man, the caveman didn't speak and the modern humans were teaching him words. In this movie, Charlie is the one who starts talking first, and Charlie starts teaching Shepard his language. And Shepard seems, even though he's an anthropologist, seems very sort of out of his element just sort of listening and trying to, well, I guess that's what an anthropologist would do as well, just sort of listening and trying to figure out his language. And later on, they bring in a linguist to help decipher his language, and when she first sees him, she's like, he's a talkative fellow, isn't he? So I thought it was very interesting that they emphasized how talkative he was, and they also made spirituality really important to him. He had like the whole third act is about his bird god, and his making things right with his bird god or whatever that is. But he's got a whole scarified bird on his chest, which we don't have any idea if Neanderthals did something like that. So it's interesting that they gave him, I don't know if he has like a full like modern language with like complete grammar and everything, but he's very talkative and has a lot of words and a very deep spiritual worldview, which I thought was a very sympathetic depiction of an ancient human.
Mm-hmm. I guess to jump ahead, I liked that he finally had enough and escaped, and kind of with the helicopter and thinking that it was the bird god kind of saying, because I don't know, I think that a religious human would react that way, like, save me, God.
That ties into what you're saying before, but maybe his brain just couldn't cope, and he was trying to kind of filter everything into a kind of symbolic language that he understood. I mean, if we, like you say, if we got like taken to Mars and then saw, like some kind of Martian technology, if we had a religious background, we might interpret it in those terms as well. So yeah, I guess. But I mean, how crap was the security in this place that they have like the only ever defrosted living Neanderthal, and the only thing that's stopping him escaping is their supposition that he won't be able to operate one push button to open the door. I mean, a chimp could work that. The bears could probably have worked that. Yeah, and that's they didn't think to maybe padlock it or have a guard there the whole time. It's just like, how he's never going to escape. He's never going to be able to figure out how to use a button. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Especially after being there for like 3 weeks watching people come in and out, and like, he's a human, he's gonna figure it out. We'd figure it out with the aliens, right?
I think Danny Glover he obviously improved a lot in his kind of security guard role between then and when he was in Lethal Weapon, because that stuff would not have flown with the later films.
Yeah. Well, when Charlie opens that door for the first time and then sees that this world goes beyond and there's other people, and that, it's probably the realization that this isn't like a random little pod that he's in. There's this world with other people, and they're so surprised that he's opened the door. And you're like, well.
One thing that kind of occurred to me when I was watching that whole kind of middle section is, the kind of parallels, and you guys will probably be able to know more about this than I do, but the parallels of, the early kind of, I guess, how I put it, the kind of human shows that there used to be, like in Belgium and other places, where they actually did what these guys are doing here and imported, like, people from the Belgian colonies, or from South Africa, and basically like stuck them in a vivarium for Westerners to gawp at. And I don't know if that was something that they were aiming for with the whole kind of section where he's like stuck in the vivarium to be studied. But I mean, that was one of the kind of parallels that jumped out at me when I was watching it, and thought, we're not all that better. This is something that could still happen if we brought back a Neanderthal. And none of the people there are kind of, all the bad scientists, as Kim pointed out, none of them have any problem with taking a living, a breathing, thinking person and putting them in what is essentially a cage to be studied. You'd hopefully, that's the kind of thing that would give ethics boards a meltdown. But they don't really explore that. I mean, there's lots of ideas in this film, again, but there's only so many that they actually explore.
I think that's a good segue to the broader themes of this movie, which are pretty clear, and then the ending resolves it in the only way that I think they thought was possible, with him dying. And so, like, one of the scientists explicitly says, like, their plan was originally, like, eventually we're going to cut him up. You can talk to him a little bit and learn what you can learn, but we are going to cut him up eventually. And then over time, he sort of convinces them, like, no, he's a real person. You can't just cut up a real person. And they're like, yeah, I guess you're right, but, like, what are we going to do with him? We can't keep him in a cage. He can't adapt to human society. Like, a priori, we know he's not going to be able to do that. And so then in the end of the movie, he dies because the movie can't resolve what's going to actually happen to him. So I think online, a lot of people really hate the end of this movie, and I also really hate the end of this movie.
I kind of liked it because I felt like he took back control of his life because it was his decision, right? So it almost took his
Did he, though?
autonomy back.
That's what the movie is saying. It wants it to be a happy ending because he took control. So in the end of the movie, after he gets out and then he accidentally kills somebody and then they put him back in the cage and then they're trying to decide what to do with him, and Shepard believes he was on a dream walk when he got trapped in the ice. So he's like, let me take him on a dream walk and let him finish his dream walk. And I don't know if Shepard learns the language well enough, but the story he believes is that something bad happened and he was responsible for the death of his family, which is why he was on a dream walk. And they draw a parallel with his religion to Inuit religion, where there's some sort of bird god who is a god but also a trickster, and sort of, depending on the context, will be either good or bad to you. And so he sees the helicopter at some point fly over the facility, and he gets the idea that the helicopter is his bird god. And so when they're on this dream walk, for some reason the helicopter flies over them and flies really low over them. I don't know what is wrong with this helicopter pilot. And Charlie grabs onto the ski of the helicopter, which immediately goes up 1,000 feet in the air for some reason.
They didn't know he was on there.
And then Charlie lets go and falls to his death. And at first Shepard is horrified, but then his face turns into a little smile and freeze frames on it, and that's the happy ending.
Yeah, I didn't like that. They should have just left it at Charlie falling.
Yeah, here's my friend. Oh, he's falling to his death horribly. But that's good somehow. Yeah, I didn't like the ending. Because we put him in this horrible situation. I mean, there's other ways they could have ended it. They could have had him, almost the kind of reverse of Encino Man, have him go back to the cave where he was from, and then have the helicopter trigger an avalanche or something, and then he gets reburied. Or he could find some more of Neanderthals in the cave and have one of them blocks of ice collapse on him or something. I mean, I can see what they were aiming for, this idea that he was gaining back autonomy of his life, but he's not really, because he thinks the helicopter's something that it's not, and so it may feel symbolic to him, but when he hits the ground, it's going to be as real as anything, whether Shepard's smiling or not.
Yeah, but then he's dead, so then what does it matter? If he thinks that it's his god, and he thinks his god is come to save him, and he dies thinking that, then that's good, right? Like, we should all hope for so much.
We could look at it symbolically and say that, I guess, I mean, it really has saved him. It saved him from being cut up into bits. I mean, that might be the better way to look at it. Or
a life in that weird terranium thing.
Yeah, those are near the end. One of the things I quite liked was when the weird helicopter pilot's like flying really low, and everyone's kind of chasing them. Now they realize he's escaped. Is the idea that there's the kind of the ice flows break, and there's like a literal gulf between a literal crevice between Shepard and Charlie. That was quite nice. A bit heavy-handed perhaps, but the kind of symbolism was there, which was quite cool.
Mm-hmm.
So everything we're talking about here, this it belongs to the noble savage trope, which is this old idea that non-Western indigenous peoples are somehow more pure and untainted by civilization, and They foreshadowed this theme all the way through the movie, because like it's the relationship between anthropology and scientists. The scientists are bad guys, and they show this dichotomy between new scientific technology and humanity in a lot of ways, because they have lots of contrasting. Did you notice how many video games are in this movie?
Yeah, quite a lot.
And this movie's from 1984. In one of the early scenes, I don't remember Principal Strickland from Back to the Future. I don't remember what his character name was.
That's how I think of him as well.
He's playing a handheld Nintendo Donkey Kong game, but it's 1984. This was even before the NES, the original Nintendo, came out.
Listen, I had that actual Donkey Kong. I played that like from the ages of like 6 till 11. It was fantastic. But yeah, it's pretty ancient.
Yeah, and later on they have them at an arcade, or they have a bar where there's a lot of arcade machines and stuff. And Ross is holding up his Space Invaders t-shirt that he's wearing.
Classic.
So yeah, so the theme, it's a similar theme to the other two movies we've already watched. All these movies are thematically very similar, which is sort of criticizing our modern culture by looking through the lens of somebody from an ancient culture. So they're being very critical of scientific Western society, with the whole idea that scientists just want to cut up this person to learn what they can in that way. And that's all a good, positive message, but the problem with the noble savage trope is that it's not true, and it's harmful to non-Western peoples to be taking everyone who's not Western and lumping them into one big group and saying you're simple and old-fashioned and sort of quaint and innocent, which is...
It's paternalism, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sympathetic in a way, saying like, oh, these are positive qualities, but at the same time, it's like, you're paternal, as you say. It's treating people like children. Mm-hmm. And they do this with Charlie, and they do this with the Inuit, who are represented in pretty sympathetic way in this movie, but still they use a lot of what we would now consider racist slurs about Inuit people, and they say some pretty bad things in the beginning of the movie. But then the other problem is that they draw a direct connection spiritually between the Inuit and the Neanderthal from 40,000 years ago, and Charlie says explicitly that his bird god is a very similar mythology to the Inuit, which doesn't make any sense on any level because there's 40,000 years of difference. So what you're saying is that even if there could be cultural connection between Neanderthals and Inuit, which doesn't make any sense because they're totally different populations, what they're saying is that the Inuit culture hasn't changed over 40,000 years, whereas Western culture is changing rapidly, and it's condescending to indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. And so in the end, when he falls to his death, Kim, as you say, it's meant to be a positive thing that, like, within his worldview, his life is complete, and he feels positive about this moment. But from our perspective, our thinking was either he's going to be trapped in a cage or he's not going to be be able to fit in, so this is the only option. Well, we didn't try to see if he could fit in. Just because he's not Western doesn't mean he can't adapt to Western society, and that's where the problematic view of the ending comes in. Like, we assumed that he is less than, Western people, and we didn't explore that to give him a chance. So that's why I hate the ending.
Yeah. That's true. I think for me, it's just that's what I would prefer in that situation. Like, if I woke up on Mars, I don't think I would want to. I think I'd be happy just to go, like Charlie.
It's almost like, have you guys read Slaughterhouse-5, Kurt Vonnegut?
No.
One of the themes in that is that the main character gets put in a zoo on Mars, like happens to Charlie here, essentially. But they treat him a lot better. I think the Martians are probably a bit more advanced than we are. And so he's put in like I think if I'm remembering it right, they put him in like a reproduction of a 20th century house. And they also abduct a female woman to be his companion. And so he's in a cage, but he doesn't mind it so much. But yeah, that's what some of this reminded me of as well. And talking about things that are problematic in it, I thought, I feel slightly affronted by you guys saying that the scientists are always the bad guys, having kind of maybe slightly more sympathy with science than others. But the anthropologist is a bit of a dick as well. I mean, what really kind of sort of shows it to me is when he's introducing Dr. Brady to Charlie in the vivarium, and that doesn't go particularly well, but he's basically forcing her to kind of interact with this guy, and she's obviously frightened, as you would be, and doesn't want to. And then the way he protects her is by saying to Charlie that she's mine. I mean, what's that all about?
Yeah.
That's just really creepy, I thought.
Yeah. No, I mean, when I say scientists, I mean Shepard in that too. Just
okay.
People that are there for it. Yeah.
The context for that scene is that they were still like doing medical tests on Charlie. They'd periodically tranquilize him to pull him out and do medical tests and throw him back in, and he'd wake up with these wounds. And he was very stressed about that. And there's a scene where he basically asked Shepard to kill him. He gives Shepard a spear and points it at his chest, and he's like, "Kill me." And so Shepard is trying to like help him. And there's a scene that's in possibly Brady's apartment or something. I'm not sure where they live at this. She seemed to be living in some house in the town beside the facility or something like that. But they're in some apartment, and he says, he's a man. Contact with a woman might bring him out of himself, might lead to something new. And then, so like, that was the plan right from the beginning, is like, hey, maybe he wants to have sex with you. Maybe thinking about having sex with a woman will make him forget that he wants to die because he's being tested on in a medical facility. And then, yeah, she volunteers very,
under duress.
Yeah. And she comes into the vivarium with them, and things go expectedly poorly. And Shepard is telling her, like, just relax, just go with it. I'm like, eee, this is terrible. And I don't know if you know anything about Timothy Hutton recently, but in the context of the recent Me Too movement, this is even worse. You haven't heard this story?
No.
Basically, Timothy Hutton has been accused of rape while he was in Vancouver filming this movie.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, so that's hard to watch that scene, knowing that context.
That's Shepard?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, that's a bad scene.
Yeah.
That scene has not aged well.
Nope. But one other note that I made, just to kind of veer quickly away from that horrific scene, is that when he's asking him to kill him, the spear that he's got, they very clearly early on show us that he's fire hardening the end of it, which I thought was quite neat. That's something that correct me if I'm wrong, but that's something we know Neanderthals did, isn't it? Fire hardening, or at least even pre-Neanderthals, things like the Clacton spear from South England, and the stuff from Schoningen, that's all kind of fire hardened technology. So that was something that I thought was quite neat.
Yeah, the German spears are, I think, 400,000 years old, so definitely that was a technology that would have been available.
So I wonder where they got that, but then missed everything else. Like, where did somebody read that somewhere and then just ignored all the other stuff around it?
Yeah.
Yeah, this movie is a year before I was born, so it's hard to get the perspective of scientists at the time to know what the paradigm in the field was. But I'm pretty sure that in the 1980s, it was still the multi-regional model of human evolution was still relatively prominent. So the idea that Neanderthals could have been the direct ancestors of Inuit was probably not scientifically implausible at the time, even though now we know that the Neanderthals are not ancestral to any living modern humans. So yeah, with such an old movie, it's important to try and figure out that context, which I don't know well enough exactly what was happening in the 80s in paleoanthropology.
I think you're right. I was only 1 when this came out, but it sounds correct.
It's terrible being old.
Oh, you were what, 5?
Yeah, 4, actually.
Yeah. So.
And you there's a line that you said earlier, Kim, that you really liked. What was that one?
Synthesizing DNA.
Yeah, synthesizing DNA. That was great, because that's
Do you want to
something
explain
that's really difficult.
Why that's hilarious, Ross?
Well, I mean, it's just it's just weird. I mean, that's not really a sign of anything.
Yeah. Well, I just think that synthesizing was a scientific word that synthesizing means to produce, just in case any listeners don't know.
Yeah. So cells that are dividing or multiplying will be synthesizing DNA, but nothing else. So if he's synthesizing DNA, it's probably in his testes and nowhere else. Because that's the only place where it happens regularly enough that it would be picked up. But I'm not sure that's what they were going for. But yeah, that's a great line, just because it's, scientific gobbledygook. But I think my favorite line was from Dr. Brody, which is when she comes into Charlie's enclosure and she says, "I was stepped on by a horse when I was 6 years old." As if it's like some kind of massive insight into her background and her characterization, which isn't really explored very much. But the idea that she was stepped on by a horse when she was 6 years old is probably the most we learn about her background, really.
So that's why she doesn't care about cutting up people or hurting animals.
Yeah, that's what ruined her.
Yeah.
One thing, again, the historical perspective, when we're watching a movie that's older than the 90s, when they're talking about DNA, my understanding is that people didn't really know what DNA was before the combination of Jurassic Park and the O.J. Simpson trial, right? I think the O.J. Simpson trial did a lot to bring DNA into the public consciousness. And both of those happened around like 93, 94, I think, right?
Yeah.
So I was interested that they were talking about DNA at all, because I don't know that people would have really had a grasp on what DNA meant at the time.
Well, it probably would have just sounded like jargon, right? Something that they may have vaguely known.
I don't know. I mean, I think like in 84, you've got, that's when PCR is invented, which is a cornerstone of any biotech lab anywhere in the world today. But yeah, definitely like the idea of DNA as a genetic blueprint. I mean, Jurassic Park has a big part to play in public understanding of that. But also, Jurassic Park was a book before it was a film. So the book was out a few years before.
The book was only 1990.
90. And then I guess you also have, the Human Genome Project. I'm not sure exactly when that started, but that's going to be late 80s, I think. So after this film. But yeah, any kind of high school educated individual should have, hopefully, even in the 80s, some understanding of DNA and what it does, enough that they would recognize it as something sciencey, at least.
When they say his cells are synthesizing DNA, there's a computer monitor showing a sort of skeletal body with some glowy areas in it, and the words on the screen are C11 thymidine tracer.
Oh, so an amino acid tracer?
This is what...
Thymadine's amino acid, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
It's part of a nucleotide base?
I think thymidine is a base, but not within... So thymidine is the base that joins to the deoxyribose part. So together, the deoxyribose and thymidine is called thymine, I think. This is me reaching back into the early days of my actual biochemistry degree 20 odd years ago. But I think that's so, yeah, it's not even actually DNA, it's just the base that's talking about there. So yeah, it's almost right. I think that we could say it's almost right. But they talk about DMSO quite a bit in there as well, and how that's really important. And DMSO does get used in DNA applications, so it's one of the things that you sometimes occasionally use in polymerase chain reactions when you're trying to amplify DNA. If it's a particularly problematic template, if it forms lots of secondary structures, so like if the DNA that you're trying to amplify is such that it'll form loops or kind of secondary structure, then DMSO you can add into it, and it helps to kind of smooth it out to enable the PCR to work. So, DMSO does have something to do with helping DNA to replicate in the test tube anyway. So it was interesting that of all the things they could have mentioned, that was one that they brought up.
So yeah, somebody did some cursory reading of an encyclopedia and then pick and choose, I guess. Anything else? Any other comments on it?
Maybe we can summarize by putting ranking our first three episodes here. I think these first three movies form a really good trilogy because they stretch over about 30 years and they cover pretty much the same theme. Caveman in modern times, in various different forms.
Yeah.
Are we all ranking Encino Man at the top?
Yes.
Of course.
for sure.
Yeah, there's no
No
doubt
question.
there.
Yeah.
And then between these two, which is between Iceman and William, which one is better?
I like Iceman better.
I like William better.
I would watch Iceman again. I would not watch William again.
I wouldn't watch either again, I don't think, but I would put William above Iceman.
Really?
I just found William more interesting. William the character. I found William more interesting than Charlie the character.
Maybe it's that it had Neil Young in it, so that just solidified it.
That's what it is. That's what it is. And I mean, we didn't talk about it, but apart from Neil Young, I thought the music in the film was actually really good. It was quite atmospheric and nicely done.
Yeah, I liked it too.
And in the 5-minute introduction credits, you get quite all these kind of fancy shots of the ice block and the helicopter, and a really nice kind of orchestral soundtrack over the top of it, which I thought was actually quite nice.
Yeah, I agree. It says it was filmed in BC, and I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect that the lab areas, like all that cement building, that looks like Simon Fraser University. It's all cement like that.
It reminded me of the halls I stayed in as an undergraduate, that kind of whitewashed breeze block. That's classic student accommodation.
Yeah. Okay, well, we should probably, I don't think anybody's going to want to listen to us more than an hour. Do we need like a sign off?
And we could mention, the next one's going to also be Iceman.
So next week we're going to watch the one that Ross watched last week.
I'm quite happy to explain that it was all my fuck up. And
So thanks for listening to the Iceman podcast, where we review movies called Iceman. Next week, tune in for Iceman, and then for the next 4 weeks, we'll watch all the rest of the Iceman movies. Thanks to David Bach for designing our cover art. You can see more of his work at dkbach.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out what Canadian paleoanthropologists are working on at pasc-scpa.ca.